off. Remember why we do that? And some of your peer mentors want to say something. Wandling from the English department. He has a PhD from Stanford and an MA from Cal, and a BA as well, I think, right? BA from Cal, MA and a PhD from Stanford, right? His scholarly interests are many and wide-ranging, and he's a great teacher, and you'll be incredibly fortunate if you land in one of his classes at some point. Some of you will become English majors, and you'll find him teaching you about romantic literature, about James Joyce, or 19th century British literature, all kinds of interesting things. You might also be a teacher of yours. Are you teaching sophomore year? Freshman year. Freshman year. Okay. So you might see him in another class, and he is a highly respected, beloved teacher on our campus. He's also one of the heroes of our program. He was one of the original founders of our program and worked in our program as a faculty member for many years. So we are so very happy to have him back. Please give Professor Tim Wandling a warm welcome.
And I have friends that go back and writer friends that, they say, oh, I have to do this research. I'm going. I don't know. I think that's another answer, but it just made it more complicated for me. And also, Cuba exists as a story in my mind, and I really like that story. And it's a gift in a lot of ways from my family. And so to go back would be to have to revise it in a way that I don't know I'm ready to do.
What am I?
PowerPoint presentation. I'd like you to hear the author's voice if you have yet. How many of you have listened to that clip before? So that's the first time you're maybe hearing her voice. Right? What I just want to emphasize right from the start is notice how she uses words like story. And if she were to go back and visit Cuba, she's never been there, she'd have to revise, just as she would an essay or a story. She'd have to do an active revision to rethink what Cuba means to her, right? She's not a first-generation immigrant. She's somebody whose Cuba comes to her through her parents' stories. They're not lived experiences of her own. All right, that's better. We'll start at the beginning. So, how much hurt can fit into a word? That's a phrase that I picked out of this book that I think is really important. I want to talk about the character in this book, Lizette, right, and her experience of words. And I want to ask you, did this book kind of speak to you at all? I'm amazed that so few of you have this book with you today. I'm not going to scold you about that, but I am going to invite you to I just started reading this book this week, and this is what my book looks like. Right? And I know I'm crazy, okay? So I just admit that. I love words. I think Lizette also loves words. And I'll talk with you a little bit about that. But I want to know, as you've read this book, I don't know if you're as far along in the book as the syllabus has indicated you are, but did you feel called into certain situations of identity, of sympathy, of saying, yeah, I feel a little bit like that? So let me give you some examples. How many of you are from Southern California? Do you feel sometimes coming to Northern California is a bit strange? You can identify with going to a different place, right? So this book speaks to you in that way, right? It's almost like you're in a different country sometimes, right? How about, are any of you from an urban city? Right? Not very many of you are from an urban city, but you might feel that coming to Sonoma State and Sonoma County is really almost like a farmland to you, right? It's a really rural area if you're used to living in the urban city, and that's something the character experiences going to what is really Cornell University in upstate New York. How many of you have ever wondered if you're dancing good enough in a club? Like you're at a club and you're kind of thinking maybe your moves aren't good enough? How many people, raise your hand if you've had that experience. All right, I appreciate the honesty, right? Way more of you. See, the fact that so few of you raised your hands gets into the slippery surface between truth and fiction that I want to talk about today, and how much play there is to that, because way more of you have had that thought, right? But Lizette is really uncomfortable when she's up in Cornell, when she's up at the university in upstate New York, but she is very at home on the dance floor, right? She and her friend, when they get to that dance floor, they own it, right? And then she's looking out judgmentally at everybody else, making fun of their lack of rhythm, their lack of moves, their lack of ability. And you might see yourself maybe as the butt of her satire there, if you've ever been self-conscious on a dance floor. Right? For most of the story, for a lot of the story, as she's moving to college, she's feeling herself to be like the one that's not quite fitting in and trying to deal with that. How many of you are professors in the room? Raise your hand if you're a professor. You guys are in here too, right? Did you see yourselves in here? Did you guys see your professors in here? Crazy professors. Did you see that? I told you we're crazy, right? It's really insane, I said. The professors, our teachers, they're like obsessed people about their subjects. They are crazy. All right, so that's your professors, right? We're in here too. All right, so just to say, there's lots of different social groups that you can belong to, right? Are you, is anybody in the room? I'm one myself, so I'll raise my hand. A first-generation student, the first person in your family who went to college. That's great. You guys are my peeps. I love you guys, right? This book is all about you, right? It's all about that social awkwardness, sometimes of not knowing how to negotiate the social identities of being a college student. I love that moment in this book when she's kind of at the meeting for, to support people of color, and she hasn't never even heard that term before. And one of the people she meets says, "I'm a legacy," and she's like, "What the hell is a legacy?" Right? So there's a kind of a lingo that you learn to speak in college that's just completely alien to her. Right? It really is alien to her. She uses that phrase exactly. All right, so that's another kind of social identity that she's negotiating, is being a college student, being an academic, and moving into that world and away from that world. And if you are doing that, those of you who raised your hand, you're doing amazing work. And Lizette is doing amazing work throughout this book. She is negotiating in really complicating ways
complicated ways, those social identities. One of my favorite moments in this book is when she's talking back home with her friends, and one of them says, "Irregardless," right? And what does she do? She has a flash in her mind of a red oval circled around that word "irregardless" from a paper that she wrote in college, right? I do that too. I can remember things that professors wrote on my papers when I was 18 or 19 years old, when I was your age, when I was first coming to college. It's excruciating, right? It's humiliating, particularly if you're used to getting by just on being witty and clever, or hardworking or something, right? Because she was the star of her high school, right? She got into college and it was announced on the PA system, right? That's a pretty bad high school, right, that she's coming from, right? So she has this sort of track record of success, but when she gets to college, it's extremely difficult for her and humiliating in some sort of ways. But what I think is so amazing about her identity is that she is able to negotiate that in the moment all the time. She's able to see that red oval around the word "irregardless" and not say something to the person who said it, because in Miami, it's okay to say that. In that social scene, you don't want to be correcting somebody's grammar, right? Because then you cast yourself as outside of that social scene. So she's trying to maintain her place in multiple worlds. On the syllabus for this lecture, I think it said my title was something, something, something in self, and I decided to change it to plural. Right? It's understanding selves. Lizette has multiple selves that she's trying to negotiate in this story. Most concretely, I think, in the choice between sort of fixing her fate to her boyfriend back home and exploring other love possibilities, right? I think that as this book progresses, you definitely get a sort of Team Omar versus Team Ethan feeling as you're reading the book. You might have a rooting interest as you're reading the story, thinking which of these guys she's going to end up with by the end of the story. Anybody with me on that? You kind of wondering about that? Thank you. I love the Wanderers, okay? So, and I'll tell you another thing that I think, I've read a lot of autobiographies. This isn't quite an autobiography, but it sort of is, right? It's dealing with that move from one place to another in terms of social standing. And there's another alienating thing that she experiences in her life all the time, from the time she's a kid all the way through this book. And that is her fascination with language. And in some ways, to me, it's kind of not true to the character, because her character is a scientist, right? She's telling us that she's actually experimenting with water and contamination, things like that. And so her profession isn't like mine, an English professor. But the person who wrote this book, she is an English professor, right? And her fascination with words and with the play of words carries throughout. And that can be kind of alienating too, because I've known from long and sometimes bitter experience that not everyone is as fascinated with words as I am. Right? But if you are fascinated with words and making meaning out of things, I hope you'll enjoy this lecture, and I hope that you will take up Scott's invitation to take at least one class in the English department and see how we do that. We play with meaning a lot, and I'm going to do some of that today. So I'll make this PowerPoint available to Scott to put up on the Moodle afterwards, so if you want to listen to that full 5-minute interview talking about this book with Janine Crissette, you can. In terms of just sort of ideas that interest me, these are sort of traditional things I've taught about. I've been doing this lecture at FWE for quite some time, and I've never talked about this book, so I'm adapting it to this book a little bit. But I want to make an argument with you guys about the power of the imagination itself, that ability and language as play, they kind of work together for me, but it is our ability to think, it sounds like a cliche, to think outside of the box, that allows us to see things anew and to understand stories that we might not otherwise understand and to solve problems that we might not otherwise solve. I think we need our imaginations. I think that's the most important thing that you can develop and hone in your lives. And I don't care about your discipline. I think that's true for all disciplines, from the sciences to the social sciences to the humanities. I want to think about this storyteller and how she's narrating herself all the time. Crissette is very careful to have Lizette talk in very clear ways about the process of storytelling and the process of making a self out of the story that's being told. But not just in the sense that she's writing a book, but in the sense that we do this all the time as we walk through life, as we think, what should I say? How am I going to look? How's this scene going to be tomorrow? And you think about it ahead of time. Maybe not all of you do that. That's what I mean. I think there is kind of an obsession with words in this story that carries probably from the author more so than that kind of character, but I'm not sure. Do you guys feel like you're wondering right now, or maybe not right now, but you'll be thinking exactly what you're going to say to somebody when you see them on Thursday or Friday? Does those kind of thoughts go through your mind? They go through our characters' minds all the time. And then I want to make sure to talk a little bit about passing today and show a great clip from a movie called 6 Degrees of Separation that talks about passing and identity, right? So I'll define that term for you. Scott mentioned that I love the Romantic poets. Lord Byron is my favorite. And this is one of my favorite quotes. And I usually use this quote in this lecture, but I'm going to use 2 today, because this is a very famous claim for the power of words. The Romantics are very big on that idea. Words have power. Words have agency. They can change the world, right? What Byron is saying here is that they're things, they're tangible. A word can exist, and that word, in any form, has the power to make millions think if it falls upon a thought. Right? It doesn't matter who wrote it, how long ago, and in what obscure circumstances. You today can read a story or a poem that was written by somebody that was alive 4 centuries ago and connect with their thoughts and their ideas. All right, very traditional. I haven't shown this one before, but I thought I would today because it really fits the story we're looking at. Right before that very powerful claim about the power of words, Byron also says he's talking about a poet in that passage, and is saying his strain, which is the words that he was reciting as a poet, displayed some feeling, right or wrong. And feeling in a poet is the source of others' feelings. But they are such liars and take all colors, like the hands of dyers. Right? Poets are liars. Writers are liars. Why on earth would Byron say this, right? And then it's after this one. That stanza 87, and 88 is the one I just showed you a minute ago, right? What he's talking about is the fact that we're rhetorical in nature. We're not trying to tell you the truth. We're trying to get you to feel something or think something. Right? There's kind of an argument at play in poetry. Right? So we might be using feelings or ideas or some claim to truth to inspire you or to get you to think something, or maybe just to make you feel better. Lizette does this all the time in this book. She is constantly negotiating the truth. All right, what is the truth? It's very slippery in this book. Do you get a clear sense of truth in this book? You know, what is true, right? It's always a good question, right? A very objective question. What is true? So let's start with this story right here. This is a good one. How many of these things are true? Mommy was a single mother with 2 young daughters. She traveled from Cuba to Florida by raft, still nursing the youngest of her daughters. The eldest daughter, I think I've inversed the I and the D there, Leedy, almost drowned on the trip. Oh my goodness. This is also a reading quiz for you guys. If you haven't read far enough into the book, you're like, I don't remember all this stuff. Right? The father of these children had abandoned them. That's a pretty compelling narrative of a single mother journeying from Cuba to Florida and surviving and carrying her children, nursing her child till her milk becomes dry dust or something like that. I think it says in that story. Does anybody remember where in the book that story is from? I know most of you don't have your book from you. Where is that story from? Yeah? In what context is the story being told? Thank you. Right, she told the media this story, right? Right? As you read that, did you think, wow, I didn't know that about her backstory? Right? No? You shake your head no. What did you think? Exaggerating is what Lydia says, right? She says, Mom's exaggerating. You can't go exaggerating like that, right? So this is all kind of BS, right? But this is a public representation of truth by a Cuban woman who's getting up there to speak on behalf of Ariel, the boy who's been, brought over from Cuba on a raft with his dying mother. And Mommy is sort of making a solidarity claim with this other mother who's dead, who's gone. So is there some truth to this? What does Lady says? She says about this, why can't I read? She describes this as straight up stole my life story and put it in Cuba 20 years ago. Right? Lady's the one who's got whose father didn't stay with her, right? She's got a baby, Dante, that the father has run off, and she's left without a father figure. Her father, the husband of Mommy, stayed with him throughout the 20 years of marriage or 18 years of marriage until the youngest daughter went off to college. So you could say this is all BS, but I would say it's not all BS. I'd say there's a lot of truth to it as well, because the way that Crissette describes that relationship is kind of an abandonment from the very beginning. It's never really quite working. They got together very young, and they never really meshed. So that woman may, in fact, have felt abandoned the whole time, right? Even though she was with that man for 20 years. Right? Her experience of being a mother, I'm not going to have a time to explore this, but it's one of my questions at the end. I'm really fascinated by the water images in this story, the canals and the oceans and the tears and the different forms of water, ice, snow, mud. One of my favorite scenes is when they're stuck on the golf course, right, having sex, and that's so mortifying when they have to call that, and just the humor of that scene, right? But there's a sort of a water ambiance to a lot of this. I think water and words are both very permeable, and they both flood this story with meaning. But always stories, Mommy's telling this story to have an effect in the world, isn't she? Is it true? Well, maybe parts of it are true. Right? It's certainly true for the mother of Ariel. And why does the father of Ariel now want that child back? Is a really interesting question. This is, of course, based upon an actual incident. If you look up the story of Elian Gonzalez, this actually happened in Florida. All right, so I'm going to leave the story for a minute and talk about perspective. Does anybody know what that is? How about that? I'll see if I can see what it is if I come up here. Anybody have an idea what that is, what you're looking at there? Humanity on Earth is right in the middle, right? Does that make sense? Right. That is the Ptolemaic view of the solar system. Right? It predominated European thought from the Greeks through the Romans, all through the Middle Ages, until a fellow named Copernicus moved himself to another point in the room, which I just did. Right? When you look at that from where I am, first of all, the telescopes were beginning to be good enough in the time of Copernicus that they knew this system wasn't accurate. It wasn't accurately predicting where planets and bodies should be. So science was beginning to catch up with worldview. But if there's one thing that we know, just by common sense, it's that the world is flat and not moving. We can all agree upon that, especially if we're alive in, say, the year 1350 or something like that, and living in Europe, right? That's common sense. So how do you get beyond common sense to another perspective? You need to move yourself around the room and use your imagination to move yourself around the universe. What Copernicus needed to do was he needed to imagine himself not in the center of things, as people had done going back through his entire intellectual tradition, humanity on Earth there in the center of things, but instead to imagine what if we are in fact moving even though it doesn't feel like we're moving, spinning really quickly and rotating around the sun. This is all stuff you guys take for granted now. You believe that without questioning it. But back then, people believed that we were stationary without questioning it. To speak against this was heresy, to get yourself excommunicated or maybe even killed by religious and political authorities. Right? That's how powerful that worldview was in the medieval era and all the way through. Right? So, but it took an active imagination. I know John Kornfeld talked with you guys about the red pill, taking the red pill. Right? So the red pill, the movie The Matrix is just a metaphor. Right? We're not actually, I hope, charging up batteries for a computer, but it is this idea that there are things that we take for granted as being true to reality that we need to think about in a critical way, and a deep critical way. And imagine we could be completely wrong on it. And I can think of no better intellectual example, or a few better anyway, than this amazing move by Copernicus and people who followed him to shift the thinking away from us being the center, humanity at the center of things, to thinking, wow, what if we're just one of the planets spinning around the sun? That was an amazing move, and it was only through the imagination. It wasn't like he observed that with science. He made that move with his imagination. That's why I claim that you have to have the imagination first. What William Blake says is what once was proved was first imagined. What is now proved was first imagined. You've got to imagine it first. Of course, he was a poet, and so he also, as a romantic poet, making powerful claims for that. Coming back to the story. Make your home among strangers, right? The note meant more than it said. I put page numbers on this, so if you want to look at these quotes in the book later on, you can. This is when she's pondering her father's note. She's had a reconciliation of sort with her father, and what's at stake here is $50, because the father's note says, hey, I forgot about the kid, so I took the $50 and I gave the extra $50 for Dante, but I still owe you $50. I had originally meant to give you more than your sister, right? So what she's doing with so many things in her life as she's reading is she's making these kinds of interpretive claims, these interpretive acts. The note meant more than it said. If you're going to engage with literary texts, with novels and stories, you need to do that all the time, because this story always means more than it says. Right? And truth is always more complicated than deciding whether something is a truth or a lie. It's always slippery, like water. Right? Earlier, just before this, I like this way that she translates, right, the silence of her father and the lack of gifts of her father. Listen to Crissette's language here. I added to this explanation what I knew to be true. Now that's I capitalized that so you can look at that passage on page 182. So she's talking to her sister and she's got cash, right? You know how it feels to get cash as a present? It's kind of like, you must have not had time to really pick out something for me. So she's like she's translating, she's adding truth. Right, what I knew to be true. Her father didn't actually say this, but she's translating for her sister, right? Based upon her reading of what her father must have meant. Right? I added to his explanation what I knew to be true. What I'd understood as hovering between Poppy's words. I love that image, hovering between Poppy's words. Think about how much meaning all the time in your lives, in your interactions with other people, all the meaning that is hovering between words. And from the way he talked about all those different job sites. Right? So she's thinking about her father's experiencing and thinking about not what he said, not what he did, but what he meant. She's interpreting him. And we do that with our parents all the time, don't we? All right. But is this truth? Is she lying? Is she making stuff up like her mother's doing? Right? There's a lot of anxiety about that story that her mother's telling. Her father's concerned about it. Her sister's concerned about it. There's a great scene when she goes out to the club on New Year's Eve, and her Omar says to her, "My mom's going to think something's wrong with you too, right?" And she's dancing there, and then the words "you too" are just like staying in her mind. Remember that scene if you got that far in the book? Right? You too. And she finally says, like, "What do you mean? Who's two?" Right? And then what does he do? He does this. Right? Do you guys know what that means? Does that symbol still mean what it means to you guys? You know what she doesn't really, she defines that, the universal single for crazy. Right? Yeah, your mom's a little loco, right? And that ruins New Year's Eve in a way, right? Or at least that ruins the dance experience for her, right? Because she's interpreting this, and why is there such concern about her mother misrepresenting truth? She does it all the time, right? Throughout this story, she's constantly negotiating truth in a way not to say what is true, but what is meant, or to translate it for people, to make them feel better. All right, the next thing I'm going to show you is time to turn off this microphone, according to Professor Miller.
Interpretation of these numbers, but I would like to just ask you, do you think those numbers are sexy? Any mathematicians in here? Are these powerfully erotic numbers? No? They are. You just have to know how to read them. All right, so I'll show you the stuff. This is from the television show Friends in the 1990s. So what happens, with
is that you as the listener, the reader, need to make meaning that isn't said. There's not one single naughty word said in that scene. Naughty, right? Nothing pornographic, and yet a very sexual description of pleasuring a woman is delivered by Monica's character there. Right? And we as readers, as viewers, are interpreting and thinking, first of all, some of you are going to go home tonight and Google 7 erogenous zones. I know. Some of you will do that because you're like, what? Because you're like Chandler. And then there's also there's a part of a universal understanding of what 7 might mean. right? But maybe not, right? You have to think about that. And depending on where you are in your own social identity, right, that scene may offer some challenges in terms of interpretation and understanding, but it also might be like you laugh because you get what they're talking about for the most part. So always, literary analysis is understanding what is meant, but it's not said. Right? In a way, it's offering a gloss on something, more than what's actually said. I noticed in this book that Chrisette loves symbols. Right? Can you read this story? I thought it might be a fun exercise for you guys to try to, we're not going to have time to do it in class, but if you want to do this, do you know all these symbols, all these acronyms, all these letters, and what they mean to the story? I was wondering if you guys even know what a CD is. When she was talking about using CDs, like you guys all have your music digital, right? You don't do CDs anymore. But these are Y2K. Do you guys ever hear of Y2K? There's a lot of talk about Y2K in this book, right? Year 2000. She's got an A in PE. She's got a D and a C minus. Her name is L. Back home, right? She has a GPA. She's talking with an RA. Right? There's a PA. There's a DJ. Okay, right? That's a running joke between her and Ethan. Those are her grades that she gets in her report card that define who she is, that say so much to her. And she's reading that whole story of what those grades mean. There's not just marks on a paper, right? Are they showing her mercy? Are they showing her pity? Is she rising up? Is that a good thing? Is she getting advantages, right? She's puzzling a lot over that report card when she looks at it. Those marks on the page mean so much more than just like marks on a page. Driving under the influence comes up. The CIA comes up. The United Nations comes up. The Immigration and Naturalization Services comes up. Right? A lot of different letters. If you just looked at this page but quickly, you'll see just a lot of usage of that, and I just thought I'd point that out. And I have my favorite example is probably this one. Her name, Lizette. Right? What happens to her name when she goes to college? They call her Liz. Right? Has that happened to any of you? Like people just started calling you something else, like than what you weren't called before, right? Because they just looked at your name and they say it differently, or they just assume that you're using a nickname or something like that. Thank you for raising your hand. Right? This is what happens. Right? She meets this woman, Dana. She spoke. Every time she spoke, it had the unintentional side effect of convincing me that she was some sort of alien, or maybe a poorly designed alien robot. All right. You guys ever have the experience at Sonoma State that you're in an alien world? You're like, what is going on here, right? I'm in this different place. And of course, you're always going to wonder, am I the alien? Am I the one who needs to change my differentness, my otherness, and fit in here, right? So I think what you've got to do is you've got to take the ET, right, out of your name and get Liz, right? I love wordplay, okay? That's what I do. I think that, I don't know that if I ever meet this author, I'll ask her if she meant that on purpose, right? But I saw E.T. because of her use of language all the time. But it's interesting because you don't get E.T. when she's talking about that, you get L. She doesn't say she's dropping the E.T., she's dropping the L, which is what people back home call her, just based on the first initial of her name. Hey, L. Hey, bro. Hey, dude. What's up? Right? So she's changing her identity there on the basis of her name. But that reference to aliens and the dropping of ET from her name just makes me think there's something about that process of feeling alienated and feeling other that the author might have been going for there. And if not, I had fun putting ET in the PowerPoint. When she comes back after being home for Thanksgiving, she spent the night in her roommate's bed watching a British comedy that she didn't understand. Her roommate comes back and she says, it took a second to remember she was talking to me. I was Liz again, no more L. Right, so Liz and L are two different kind of identities for her. Right, drop the as Lizette. Which gets to the point I made earlier today, which is that there are multiple versions of herself. Lizette wonders about the two versions of herself, one seen from the foggy future, looking back at the Lizette in Omar's car. That foggy future, again, fog is a kind of a mist or a watery kind of thing, and she's constantly throwing her imagination into the future and imagining what a scene's going to look like or how it's going to play out. She says the truth is right? As if we could say what truth is in a story like this. I had to abandon some part of myself to leave Omar in Miami. The ready to go scene is such a funny scene to me because it's a comedy. She's a comedy writer by her training, right? And so that scene is based upon the misunderstanding. He's like, "You ready to go?" And she's like, "Well, I guess." She's thinking about this, right? She's thinking about going back to New York, going to college. Or this is thrown back to the night before she's headed off to college. They go off to that golf course, ended up getting stuck in the mud. And then he gets all in a huff. He's like, "Well, if you want to go, he thinks she means right now. You're ready to go right now, right?" And so, but then they end up stuck in the mud, so they have to call the tow truck. It's totally mortifying. She makes claims about her ability to negotiate, in particular her father, but really people in general. She does this all the time. The difference between me and my mom and Lady was that I could sometimes see between his words. If you're having roommate issues right now, don't trust yourself to see between the words of your roommates. Ask exactly what they mean, right? So this is kind of a dangerous, slippery slope that you get into when you start seeing between somebody's words. But it's a powerful claim that she's making in terms of her empathy and her ability to understand what people mean that they aren't able to say. She does this all the time, and she finds herself also doing this all the time. And if you look on page 163, when you go back to your seminars and look at that, there's a really great discussion of that feeling of being understood by her father as emerging from underneath kind of an ice flow or some, holding your breath for a long time under the water and emerging into the air with a big gulp of air. That is, I think, consonant with the metaphors that begin this story of the canals, right? All the junk that's being thrown into the canal, the dead body in the canal. She tells us right off that she once accidentally fell into the canal and had to be dragged out from underneath it. Right, so there's something about like falling into that canal, falling into that water that resonates for me in this moment when she's talking about her father and coming up for a gulp of air after feeling this connection. I'm going to skip over a couple here. I'll put this PowerPoint up. You can look at this. I was going to talk about the song Anticipation by Carly Simon, which the professors in the room know, and maybe some of you have heard your parents play. But this moment where she says, "And I tell you how easy it feels to be with you and how right your arms feel around me," she's singing that as if in the moment to a lover. And then she self-consciously says, "But I rehearsed those lines just late last night when I was thinking about how right tonight might be." Probably heard that song, at least maybe some of you have heard it as a ketchup commercial long ago. But it's an interesting way that a writer thinks about it. It's a very writerly way of thinking about how we construct moments even before they happen. And Lisette does this a lot through the story. I'm going to skip over the examples I was going to look at because I'm running short on time here. She certainly does that when she meets her roommate. She has this whole elaborate idea of how she's going to explain the name Dante, right? That doesn't go exactly how she imagined it. But I want to make sure to talk about passing. So to present oneself as a member of a social group other than his or her own is the definition of passing. So anytime you're trying to fit in and pretend to be something or part of a group that you're not really part of. This can be gender, this can be sexuality, this can be ethnicity, right? Anything that marks you out as different, alien, other, and you want to try to fit in, or maybe you want to try to fit out. In any case, whenever you're moving and sort of passing for one identity, you can do that. In the context of this story, I think that it would be worthwhile for you guys to think about and discuss, is plagiarism a kind of passing, or is passing a kind of plagiarism? All right. Plagiarism is another key theme in this story because she's plagiarized a paper and she's got this whole review weighing on her mind heavily throughout the first part of this book. Right? Is she going to get to stay in college? She didn't learn proper citation skills in the school that she came from. She didn't really understand. But she, like her mother, she's borrowing and making up stories all the time, sliding the truth around just to make the things work, to make feelings work. Is that ethical behavior with truth? Right? Or is it more about relationships and what you're trying to accomplish by getting somebody to feel one way or to understand something or to feel understood? This clip is 3 minutes long, so I am going to finish with it because I love it. This is from the movie 6 Degrees of Separation. This is a character who is called... And in this movie,
is not his thesis, he plagiarized it, he stole it. It doesn't matter when he's so charming and he delivers it so damn well. So he completely captivates these folks. Right. This is a great movie about passing. Will Smith's character is passing. He is black, he is gay, he is lower class, and he's pretending to do all sorts of, he can't pretend not to be black, but he can do a lot to cover up and make these folks feel comfortable. But it's all that. And he's using the powers of his imagination. So I began today talking about the powers of that imagination. Right? I think that Bazette is that kind of character. He's not a hustler. That character is actually a hustler when you see the movie. But he's amazing, right? You want to buy that hustler. Like all those people are like, I'm going to read that book again. Sometimes every time we're interpreting things, we're making meaning out of things that we thought were said. We're adding to things, we're elaborating, we're exaggerating, we're telling stories. We're making up stuff. And there's a fine line in our interpersonal relationships between the kind of plagiarism that she's in trouble with at school for like not citing something properly, not being accurate, not having fidelity to the truth, and the kind of like really gray areas, right? Those risky gray areas that we have in interpersonal relationships. I have some more questions for you at the end of this slide. We'll be up on the PowerPoint. You're at time. I want to take a question. Take around if you have a question. I'm looking so good that people in the next class are looking at me.